I'm going to talk about the Porn Studies Journal, and that's really all I'm going to do. And I've called the talk Still Not Safe for Work. Not safe for work, of course, is the term that people use for types of media that they think their employer wouldn't like them to be looking at. And it's also the title of a special issue of Sexualities that I co-edited with Ian Hunter in 2009, which was called Not Safe for Work, Teaching and Researching Sexually Explicit. I wouldn't have imagined then that we would have a Porn Studies Journal by 2014, which is what is now actually going to happen. And I'm incredibly pleased about that and quite surprised. I want to sort of talk about what's happened since we made the announcement. My co-editor Clarissa Smith is here and has been through this with me, to talk a little bit about what it's like to be an academic who does study porn, to look at some of the responses to the announcement of the journal, which I think are kind of interesting in themselves, and also some of the issues that it raises about how, what are the responsibilities of academics who study porn, or what are the responsibilities of academics generally who study things that have a public and political presence and significance. So that's what I'm going to do. So that's what that was. The Not Safe for Work term was used in a number of reports about the journal's launch. Not Safe for Work, but Now Safe for School, Porn Studies Journal will launch in 2014. Next time you're caught looking at Not Safe for Work material, just say you're doing it in the name of research. And of course, if you study pornography, you will have heard that before. You're doing it in the name of research. Part of the problem about studying porn is the way that porn kind of signifies in a rather bizarre set of ways, actually, culturally and socially, where it becomes not a set of cultural texts or a type of media form, but a metaphor for all sorts of other things. And it's almost like this kind of vast repository where people kind of push ever more things into it, and it's very kind of effectively intense and so on. So, as Lynn Segal says, porn has been overburdened with significance. It's supposed to carry all of this significant weight, this symbolic weight. And it has been used as a kind of a metaphor for immorality, oppression, inequality, commodification, more recently individualism and neoliberalism. It's all of the bad things about our culture. But it somehow stands for, it is an emblem of. Martin Barker, who did some work looking at how broadsheet newspapers use the word porn and how, particularly in recent years, found that porn was being used in a ever sort of more imaginative way. So, we have poverty porn, we have emotion porn, we have food porn, we have all kinds of different things that aren't porn, but that have the word porn attached to them. When somebody wants to signify that we're talking about a weakness or a self-indulgence, or where somebody has lost contact with themselves or other people or the world, or where something excessive is happening. People are paying too much attention to their feelings or their emotions or their sensations or their bodies. And the word was hardly ever really being used about pornographic texts or pornographic workers or anything. But it has this kind of very broad, dense significance. When I did a piece of work for this book, Secrecy and Silence in the Research Process, which was about people's experiences of doing research. And the piece that I wrote for that was talking to people who did research pornography. And it wasn't surprising that people reported difficulties with studying pornography because of this kind of burden. So it was described as, people would think it was a thrilling thing that you were doing, not often, or it was seen as taboo. Sometimes it was seen as a joke. Sometimes people would be sorry for you because you were doing something that was heavy, difficult, and unpleasant. And as Susanna Passanen has remarked in relation to this, it's because porn is spoken about with this kind of discourse of negative affect. Hurt, anger, frustration, fear, and nausea are seen as the acceptable reactions to pornography. So in the face of that, it's very difficult to say, and I want to do something different, or I want to investigate those responses. And I think in many ways, even though more people are now studying pornography, and that there is a field, it now exists, in some ways it's actually harder than it was. Partly because I think universities and academic publishers are becoming more averse to taking risks. There was a special issue of Cinema Journal, which was published a few years ago, which was all about the problems of writing about pornography, and they had to publish the images that went with the articles separately on a CD because they couldn't get them printed up as part of the publication. It was just seen as too risky, too difficult. Nobody wanted the hassle of having to do that. And also because academic life has become more precarious. People don't want to take risks anymore, it's too dangerous. If you want to think about your career and doing well or not offending people, it's perhaps more difficult than ever before to research in difficult areas. And I think certainly people who do any kind of work that's difficult or sensitive, regardless of whether it's sexual or not, will know that it's increasingly hard to argue the case with ethics committees because it's seen as kind of just a bit too hot to handle. And actually I think we should be arguing that we have an ethical responsibility to do this kind of work. That's the line we should be taking, but it's a hard line to take. So as academic life becomes more precarious and casualised, it's more difficult to take risks. One of the headings we used in the Not Safe for Work special issue was "Don't do it without tenure." That it's particularly difficult for people to take on this kind of work if they aren't established, if they are early career, if they're vulnerable in any other way, if they're gay, if they're likely to be marginalised for any other reason. So difficult for all sorts of reasons to do what we do. And if you set that in the kind of the broader context of the way that porn is discussed at the moment in the contemporary media, we've got some really interesting things going on. Obviously, we have a kind of a continuing fascination by papers like the Mail, with kind of the vile and the sick and the sordid. But we also have the rather bizarre spectacle of the former editor of Loaded, now investigating porn addiction and declaring a state of emergency as part of Channel 4's campaign for real sex. Channel 4, which once had a reputation for rather different kinds of sex programming, but now arguing that internet pornography is distorting people's experiences of sex. It's damaging our lives, particularly young people. No evidence for this, but we'll make a whole series of programs on the back of it, because hardcore porn is just a click away. So you have the academic context and the broader social context makes things quite interesting as a background to what we're doing. And the power that is attributed to pornography is really quite astonishing. This is one campaign, and you can see here that porn is being associated with everything from losing your job, being raped and murdered, getting divorced, slavery, and sexual abuse. And this, in turn, is part of an even broader set of real kind of concerns and fears, not just about pornography, but more generally about changing use of media and technology, that often focuses on protecting the young. And I mean, I put these images weren't very hard to find, but I thought it was really interesting what protection often looks like. It's more like smothering than anything else. But there's a very odd thing that runs through a lot of these campaigns. All of these images are around protecting children. The images that are about abusing children, the images that are around protecting children are uncannily similar, I think. So, one way of making sense of this, I think it's a really useful term because it does shift our attention to the kind of emotional tenor of all of this supposed debate. The term is sex panic, and I'm using the term in the way that Janice Irvin uses it. She talks about sex panics not as a kind of isolated incident like a moral panic, like you might get a moral panic over a new drug or some kind of contemporary thing, but about something that kind of doesn't go away. There's this continual rolling program of sex panics. And she's not talking about pornography here, she's actually talking about sex education debates in the States. But I think the points that she makes are really, really interesting. She talks about what she calls an emotional culture of sex, and this goes back to what Susanna Passanen said, with kind of the discourse of negative affect, where sex, not just pornography, but things to do with sex in our culture, are associated with, and we come to feel them as, a dense mix of dread, excitement, shame and fear. So this is a very kind of heady atmosphere and environment when sex is discussed or represented publicly. And so those kinds of panicky debates, those kinds of, Walter Kendrick called them little melodramas that play out around sex, whether it's about young people sexting, or whether it's about pornography, or whether it's about W.H. Smith's stocking, erotic fiction, or whatever it is. They have a particular set of pains, but also pleasures, and it's something that we don't know very much about, but I think it's something that's very important. They draw people together because you can take a side and you can have a fight. About something. There are strong feelings of collective rage, which are painful, but also on some level, I think, pleasurable. And we can use those taking up of positions to feel aroused emotionally, to feel righteous, to feel like we are, on the right side of things and protecting the weak and so on, and that we're part of some kind of club. I don't know what to do about that.
Close. Is there an else in the drawer?
Oh yeah, close it. Okay. What makes these things particularly important is that they turn into battles over sexuality that have really weighty implications for not just kind of freedoms around regulation, like actual legislation that exists, but they exert a widespread chilling effect, and they do it in all sorts of different areas of the culture, whether it's in the academy, or whether it's in political activism or journalism or art or literature. And they all, I mean, I don't think there is an example where they have not, that kind of battle has not worked to the advantage of political conservatives. So these things are never good for sexual minorities, they're never good for alternative sexual communities, they're never good for women, they're never good for young people actually. Those people always lose as a result of these battles, but they continue. They're very, very powerful things, and I think it's something we need to know more about why this continues to happen. On the other hand, porn excites, quite sort of contradictory responses, as well as a panicky one. This is from a piece actually about the journal, Porn Studies Journal, and it's interesting the way that reactions to porn are often then transferred into reactions to porn study and to Porn Studies Journal. So this one is quotes the rather nice thing that Clarissa and I wrote as a description of the journal. We're the first dedicated peer-reviewed journal to explore pornography. We'll publish innovative work examining sexually explicit media forms, etc., etc. Wow, that quickly got a lot less exciting than the title would indicate. So as well as kind of the sort of not safe for work headlines that we got these kind of responses where you know, oh, so what? Porn's really boring, porn's completely insignificant, it's so trivial, why would you even study it? It's just like mildly amusing. So porn is, you know, it's either the scariest thing in the world, completely traumatizing and hurtful, you know, rape, murder, abuse, sexual slavery, or it just doesn't even need to be inquired into. And often you get those attitudes kind of mixed up in the same sort of piece of writing. It's very odd. We had more kind of comic responses. This was Tim Dowling in The Guardian. And these actually were, I think this is the extra thing where it's not the response to porn that gets mocked onto porn studies. This is kind of mocking the academic because, you know, academics use stupid language and are pretentious and so on. So we have, you know, the ridiculousness of trying to apply narrative theory to porn. We have remember when it wasn't described as a dialectic struggle, frequently offering a glimpse at the 21st century's misogynistic power dynamic between the self and other, because this is how academics write, and unfortunately often we do, of course, like that. But yeah, so I mean, another layer of nonsense is added to this. You know, why even study it in the first place? And then, of course, they're going to write about it in this really stupid, pointless way. So, I mean, we've been amused over a number of months collecting these things. What's also really fascinating to me is the kind of the repetition of particular kinds of imagery that you get. And so these are all just taken from the coverage. So porn is represented as being associated with sex in public spaces. It's a quite sort of old-fashioned idea, I think, of porn, of kind of areas that are actually largely disappearing from urban centres. They're being pushed out by other kinds of sexual businesses. Or you've got this one, overwhelmingly the most popular, The Keyboard, with sex or porn spelt out on the keys. And I mean, there were so many examples of these. It was just repeated over and over. So, you know, certainly porn is now definitely associated with the world of being online. It's associated with the internet. Images of women, which I've found particularly interesting, particularly because, you know, the journal is being edited by 2 women. So we had like quite a few sexy scientists looking at charts and things, because that's what academics do, look at charts and clipboards and stuff. We had these kind of rather tragic women who looked rather dissolute, like they were, you know, they'd been drinking heavily and were at the end of something. I don't know how they got it. And then just like really bizarre ones, like the banana, which was used as an image to accompany a story about the journal, or the woman in the white gloves holding the laptop. Why? I don't know what the hell that's supposed to mean. But I mean, you know, if it means anything, I think it shows that there's a kind of real lack of imagination in the way that porn's discussed publicly, and a lack perhaps of a visual language to talk about it, which is interesting. And I think there's something there about, you know, there is this kind of fascination with porn as being this kind of set of overwhelming images, which we then never show. We kind of replace them with this other kind of bizarre layer of odd images that stand in for it. Okay, so porn, the panic and the dismissal as being trivial. The other thing that happened was that a petition was started against the journal by a group, an American group called Stop Porn Culture, who thought we shouldn't have the journal because we were pro-porn, because our starting point wasn't all porn is bad or all porn is harmful. That made us pro-porn, and they collected signatures. They got 900 or so signatures. They got in touch with the publisher. They said that we should either have to include other people or the kinds of people on the editorial board, or we should be made to call the journal Pro-Porn Studies. And then somebody should set up a journal called Critical Porn Studies, which would be doing the actual job that academics should be doing if they're going to study porn. A number of the signatories of that petition wrote comments, and I just think they're interesting, and I'm not sort of putting these up particularly, I mean some of them are a bit over the top, but I do think they kind of raise interesting issues about what maybe people think academics are supposed to do, which might make us like reflect on what we think we're supposed to be doing. So first of all, this idea that was repeated a lot, porn is not a neutral topic, so you have to study it in a particular way because it's not neutral. The second thing, which was just the kind of and the kinds of academics we must be to do this, that we would be apologists dressing up our personal convictions with, the trappings of objective language or whatever, and that we would probably write articles declaring porn is wonderful for men. It would be like an academic journal promoting slavery, or it would be the equivalent of murder studies from the viewpoint of murderers. I mean, those, there was quite a lot of sort of, they didn't like us at all. Then there was the sort of the charge that we were postmodernist and populist, so that, that we had no kind of real rigour or integrity. We were this terrible kind of wishy-washy, queer theory, nonsensical people. Some of the other comments, though, that I think are really interesting, and these are ones that I've just sort of taken some typical examples, but these recurred a lot in the signatories. The obvious one, we should be representing both sides of the debate. So, the idea that there are only two anyway, there are only two ways of making sense of porn, and we should be looking at both of them. Whereas we were thinking we were actually doing something completely different. We were trying to move away from the idea that there were both sides of anything. What, for or against television, or for or against, the novel or something. It's a bizarre way of thinking from an academic point of view, but one that's still extremely powerful publicly. The second thing was that we were misrepresenting public opinion, and that's a really interesting idea, that academic work should be representing or reflecting public opinion on the subject, especially if it was deeply and critically divided. And I mean, I think that's ridiculous, obviously, in the sense that academic work is not there to simply reflect what people believe about things. But there is something quite interesting there about accountability, maybe, that we need to think about. Well, so what are we? How do we respond to the idea of a public, or what a public thinks, or what different types of groups of people think and feel about pornography? What do we do about that? A related issue was that we were censoring, because we were censoring concerns of particular groups of people. And they were child protection advocates, parents, educators, relevant professionals, not irrelevant professionals, feminists and ordinary women. It's all ever feminists. But so these are the groups of people whose voices need to be heard. And academics are seen as, I don't know, so like couldn't be an ordinary woman and an academic, or a feminist and an academic, or a parent or an educator. These camps are seen as completely separate and mutually exclusive, with academics being some other kind of weird thing. But that idea of censoring concerns is another interesting thing, and it does raise questions of what are we supposed to be doing. And then the final thing that I think takes us back to this question of affect, really, and the sort of really strongly embodied feelings about things, which was this idea that recurred, no matter what the so-called experts say, porn is harmful, it causes confusion, it hurts loved ones, and many relationships have been destroyed by it. With a number of signatories saying, I know because of my experience, this happened to me, my marriage broke up because of porn, or I was attacked because of porn. So the experiences and feelings become the ground on which you on which you claim your expertise. We see that a lot more, I think, in the media at the moment, and certainly where sex is concerned, that you can say something about young people and sex if you're a mother of two, but not if you're somebody who studies young people. There's that kind of different notions of what expertise counts. So we have started to think about, well, we were thinking about it anyway, but we've started to think more carefully about what it means to do critical work, and it's something that Larissa and I are writing about in the first issue. We are going to have a special issue on sex-critical approaches to pornography, which will be edited by Feona Attwood, who's also based at Middlesex University. We have John Mercer, who will be writing with Sheriff Mulder Bocus in the not-too-distant future on the topic of critical porn studies. And it's something that we want to keep returning to. So what do we mean by critical? And I think in lots of ways, the attacks that are made on us are very often destructive and distracting, and they stop you getting on from the thing you wanted to do. But perhaps we can kind of turn it round in a way to sort of make it into an inquiry that we want to have about, so what do we think our responsibilities are? What would they look like? What should critical academic work be? And so I just wanted to end by making a few reflections on that, really. Don't get too excited. I have actually got 3 more pages of slides. So I just wanted to end. But so that's what I'm going to talk about next anyway. And the first point to make is that actually the project of critical porn studies has been going on for some time. This isn't a new thing that we're inventing or that we've plucked out of the air. And that although this kind of work doesn't it doesn't figure in the public debates about porn, and actually when academics are asked to comment on porn, they're usually not the sorts of people who write about pornography. They're psychologists or other kinds of specialists that don't study porn, but that are expected to be experts on it. And so, I mean, these are just some of the books, recent books, which are not looking at both sides of some imaginary debate, but are looking at particular types of pornography. We've got one here on tentacle erotica, or on pornography in particular places. This one is about pornography in China, or about particular audiences, like this one, which is about women's responses and engagements with pornographic magazines in this instance. So, I mean, this isn't new. We didn't invent it, and it's been going on for quite a long time. One of the things that I think we have to take into account, I mentioned the fact that porn, and it is still associated with immorality, and there is still, I think, there's a strong objection to pornography on Puritan grounds. But I think what we have to sort of now deal with also are various kinds of disquiet around porn and more broadly sex as disciplinary. So people who are often uneasy about porn or not sure how they think it should be studied or concerned that maybe it needs to be studied in a different way to other things, will often point to its connections to a neoliberalist turn, to a post-feminist term, to an emphasis on individual pleasure, on surveillance, on self-monitoring, on consumerism, on entrepreneurialism, and I think those are critiques that we can meet head-on. But I think one of the problems about those critiques is that they are often made in a rather simplistic way. So it's kind of, this involved a commodity, therefore it is commodified, therefore it is bad, and that, it kind of, there isn't an analysis. It's just like we've sorted it and we put it in the bad box because it involves something that someone paid money for. Like, we don't pay money for all sorts of different things. And I think what we still have to acknowledge is that across lots of different kinds of objections to porn, whether they are puritanical or whether they are they come from a kind of humanist point of view or a liberal point of view or a feminist point of view, some feminist points of view, there is still a kind of deep disquiet about the mingling of sex with media technology and commerce. And it's something that I think it's jarring for lots of people. This rather badly reproduced thing here is, many of you will know, is it's a diagram produced by Gail Rubin to demonstrate what kinds of sex are seen as good and acceptable, the ones in the middle in the charm circle, and the ones that are seen as bad and abnormal around the outside at the outer limits. And it's noticeable, I think, that manufactured objects, pornography, sex for money, are placed in the outer limits. So media, commerce and sex should not meet with sex in any way. And that is really common to lots of different political oppositions to pornography. I think what's also interesting there is that there is a kind of very deep disquiet from many viewpoints that things that perform or play with gender or sexuality are also at the outer limits. So SM, butch femme couples, kinds of alternative power play type things that mess with any idea of there being a natural order to being a woman, what women are supposed to want, or to being in a couple, are also deeply suspect. And that is interesting that does run through those spectrum of opinions. Okay, so these are things that we need to address, I think, in porn studies, but I think we probably need to address them not in the way that they're raised, because if we do that, then we keep moving back into the same old tired debates. And it's difficult to imagine quite how you do that, because you want to take those things seriously, but not just to kind of shout back at them. There has to be some kind of different sort of repositioning of what we do. And I just wanted to offer a few thoughts on that. One of the things that we want the journal to do is to be actually truly interdisciplinary. I know you always have to say that, and, but we actually do, because we think that it is one of the topics that could really benefit from lots of different viewpoints. So not just media and cultural studies or psychology and sociology, but we really need people from business studies and industry studies and labour studies and performance studies and all sorts of different disciplines to pitch in, actually. So we can't kind of predict where it should go, and even though our backgrounds are media and cultural studies broadly speaking, and that's kind of where we're coming from, I don't think we see ourselves as being in charge of where it's going to go. We don't think that other people won't have very good ideas about how to study porn. But from my background, which is kind of in media cultural studies and also I think now in sexuality studies as well, these are some of the things that I think are important to orienting us to a critical form of study. First of all, this idea of being sex critical, this is a term that Lisa Downing has recently been using, to try and get away from that idea of, you're either sex positive or you're sex negative, or you're anti. We can critique all sorts of things, which doesn't mean doing the sorting exercise of deciding whether they're good or bad. It does mean actually engaging with them in a critical way. I think we need to draw on critical sexuality studies, and this is a term coined by Ken Plummer, who was the founding editor of Sexuality's Journal. And it's an approach to sexualities that puts the emphasis on the way that sex and sexuality are constructed. And I mean, he talks here in quite specific ways about, it's not a thing, it's not something that you just identify in a spot. Sexualities emerge through complex systems in specific social worlds. They're grounded in actual bodily lives, and they're embedded in wider historical structures. And because of that, they are multiple, varied and contradictory. So we would expect representations of human sexualities to also be the same, I think. They're not always the same thing. Porn isn't a thing. We can't kind of make pronouncements on it, what it is, whether it's good or bad. And if we do that, we're going down the road to sorting it. This other term, citizenship, new kinds of citizenship, I think is also an interesting way maybe of taking that debate about neoliberalism or post-feminism a bit further. In this specific moment, how can we be citizens? How can we develop a citizenship that is not kind of completely owned by the system we live in? It's obviously going to be part of it and constrained by it, but is maybe trying to do different things in new ways. So for me, this is what we can take from sexuality studies to inform the way that we study porn. And I think the other thing that we take from media and cultural studies is a particular kind of critical approach, obviously, but one I think that is attentive to the way that media and technology kind of figure in the contemporary moment. And so, it's notable that a lot of the public debate and a lot of kind of poor academic debate about porn is still based on a very kind of old mass communication model of the media, media, something that's out there, something that impinges on us. Whereas in fact those things have changed around us. We live our sexualities in mediated forms now. Though it's, the distinction has largely gone, I think. We can't make that distinction. Technology is now personal, affective and intimate, and we live in rather than with media. So what does that mean for the way that we think through the place of pornography in contemporary society? This last point I thought was a really interesting point, because it goes back to that thing of what we know and what we don't know, and whose expertise we rely on to construct critical porn studies. It's from a piece of writing by Bobby Noble about teaching pornography in universities. And he makes the argument that actually it's not so much about accumulating the knowledge that we have. We also have to unlearn what we know, because it has been so overburdened with significance, and because it's been so overdetermined by these different kinds of affect and these various kinds of metaphoric weight and so on. So we may not yet know what we need to know, not to know about porn as we approach our study of it. We have to both forget what we think we know and come to think porn from a place of active unknowing. That's my final point. That piece of writing is in press. It is in the first issue of Porn Studies. Our first issue will be a double issue. It's a biblical issue, and it will be out in March 2014. I was just talking to Carol Ann outside about the purpose of these inaugural lectures, and I know that often people use them to kind of sum up where they've been and where they've got to, but I think what I'm really interested in is kind of being at the start of something and not completely knowing where it's going to go. So yeah, that's all I've got to say. Thank you very much.